Let us turn to examine and assess the engineering work of Peter Palchinski in relationship to 4 different political regimes in Russia and then the Soviet Union. In so doing, we'll be able to examine ways in which Palchinski's engineering proposals and engineering decisions always carried political meaning in a Russian and then Soviet context. In the United States, when we learn engineering and learn engineering problem solving, we draw a sharp distinction between our technical work and politics, because we say our technical work is purely mathematical, and we are making purely mathematical judgments based upon sound principles. However, engineering problems don't get solved by themselves. Engineering problems get solved by people. As soon as you bring engineering problem solving in relationship to people and their lives, arguably one introduces politics. Peter Palchinski was educated and trained under Tsarist Russia. He, as we've discussed earlier, was trained at the Mining Institute in a European-style education, engineering education, that involved a great emphasis on technical training with some, I guess, a modicum of introduction to work in the humanities and social sciences. After completing his training, he was sent to the Don Basin to help, which was a major, in the Ukraine, which is a major source of mining for then Russia. And he was asked to examine one of the lesser important dimensions, namely the lives and experiences of workers. As you read in Loren Graham's book, he collects a great deal of data about the lives and experiences of workers, and he begins to come to the conclusion that the only way to increase productivity, the only way to have a sound technical mining process is by making sure that we took care of the lives and everyday experiences of workers. They needed good housing, they needed good food, and he began to publish on this. At first, people took this for granted and accepted his arguments, but after a certain period of time, it became the political implications were clear. The arguments constituted a critique of the organization of manpower in mines under the Tsarist regime. And Palchinski was asked to depart from his work in the Don Basin, and he was sent, deported in a way, to Siberia. This was in the neighborhood of 1905, 1906. After staying in Siberia for a short period of time, a couple of years, he found his way out. He managed to escape, and he escaped into Western Europe, where he worked as a consultant on a variety of projects, some involving mines, but more extensively working with seaport design. And it was there that he formulated what Loren Graham describes as Palchinski's distinctive approach to engineering, namely humanitarian engineering. In organizing seaports, he made the case that people who work at seaports need transportation, they need education, they need food, they need decent housing. And so Palchinski's approach to engineering expanded what counted as legitimate parts of engineering problem solving to include the features that involve the lives and activities of workers. On page 37, Loren Graham writes, "The single most important factor in engineering decisions," Palchinski maintained, "was human beings. Successful industrialization and high productivity were not possible," he repeatedly emphasized, "without highly trained workers and adequate provision for their social and economic needs. An investment in education promoted industrialization more than an equivalent investment in technical equipment, since an uneducated or unhappy worker would soon make the equipment useless. Simply adding new equipment without attention to the morale and ability of the workers would cause great waste. Human beings must be considered not hired hands, but creative individuals with cultural and spiritual needs. Concern for satisfying the needs of the workers is not just an ethical principle, but a requirement for efficient production. Can you see what's happening from the point of view of a traditional mode of engineering problem solving, which was also characteristic in the European-style training? Namely, the boundary that engineers draw around problems focused on the mathematical dimensions, leaving out dimensions that involved people. So Palchinski was making the case that to adequately solve technical problems, we needed also to pay attention to those dimensions that involve people. His approach then, humanitarian engineering, drew a different kind of boundary. It's a boundary that in his case, included anything that pertained to workers. Now this interest of his came from a combination of his technical background and his political commitment, the growing political commitment to anarchist principles, as we've discussed earlier. Let us carry the time frame forward here so you can see how Palchinski's life and status and indeed approach change over time with respect to different Russian and Soviet governments. In 1913, Palchinski gets a pardon from the Tsarist regime. Note that we're now moving into World War I. And Palchinski returns to the Soviet Union, where he establishes a research institute that brings together his work on mines and his work on seaports. He calls it the Institute of the Surface and Depths of the Earth. Now, as director, manager of this new institute, he does consultant work during World War I for Russia, becomes an advisor to basically the defense industry. And during World War I, his views shift somewhat. As someone who's very much enamored with anarchist principles and applied in local level analyses in the Don Basin and seaport design, Palchinski is someone who cares greatly about local level organization and believes that good planning can only take place when it is in a way from the bottom up. But during World War I, his views modify some, because during the war he found it necessary and important to legitimize and to promote some forms of centralized planning. It is difficult, after all, to run a war when you have various pieces off organizing themselves autonomously. So there has to be some sort of centralized coordination, but with local variations. And so Palchinski's mode of humanitarian engineering changes some to include a mix of local autonomy and centralized coordination. The word coordination here is important. During this time period, he's looking towards the future. After the 1905 revolution, the Tsarist regime had lost some legitimacy, and then during World War I, the Tsarist regime finds itself under attack. Palchinski believes that Russia is a land with vast resources, and if we had a different kind of production system, a differently organized production system, Russia could become a wealthy country, a country that served all of its people and enabled all of its people to attain reasonable standards of living with a reasonable quality of life.